Understanding Trauma and Vicarious Trauma in the Workplace. My name is Christopher Lowe. I will be your presenter for today. Just to go over the housekeeping, as I mentioned, please remove yourself from video and mute yourself on audio, just so that we're able to avoid distractions throughout. We're going to have question and answer at the end. And so please drop your questions in the chat. My colleagues are looking through the chat and will be able to ask the questions to us during that time, right? A copy of the slides will be sent to you afterwards. So I know some of you will be writing notes. We'll make sure to send these slides to you so you can supplement your notes, right? I work for Thrive in Your Workplace, which is an initiative that works with local employers on workplace mental health strategy development. And so we work with employers throughout the city, engaging them in a conversation about the importance of supporting the mental health of their employees and helping them integrate support at their workplaces, because we know that support promotes employee well-being, it facilitates access to mental health care, and we just want to help everyone create a positive mental health experience at work, right? A mental health friendly workplace. So we've worked with various sectors and lots of different organizations. We have customized recommendations for each particular organization, and we provided technical assistance. Since COVID-19, we've engaged in a lot of virtual training, right? And so this is another part of our way to reach employers and employees around mental health. So all of our resources are free. You can find them on our webpage. We have tons of webinars and tons of guides and resources that are very helpful. I'll make sure to include that information in the follow-up email, but the information is also on one of these later slides. Again, my name is Chrislyn Logue. I may be familiar to some of you DYCD providers. I used to work for DYCD many years ago, not many, like 2 years ago. And so I was a program manager in the Cornerstone unit. So if any of my Cornerstone folks are on the line, I love you all. And for everybody else that I did not get a chance to work with, I love you all as well. In regards to today's agenda, we're going to briefly talk about the objectives. We are going to go over trauma and vicarious trauma, right? Can't talk about vicarious trauma without trauma. We're going to talk about organizational strategies to address vicarious trauma. So how can we support each other as we may be dealing with this? We're going to highlight some resources and tools, and we are going to get into that question and answer, as I mentioned. Shout out Dykeman. Dykeman's in the house. So at the end of this training, hopefully, if I do my job well and you all take notes well, you'll be able to gain or reinforce your understanding of some key terms: trauma, vicarious trauma, and trauma-informed. We are going to help you recognize some signs of vicarious trauma and how you might be able to respond. We're going to apply a vicarious trauma approach to work. So I'm going to teach you some things that you all may be able to do at your places of work. And we're going to talk about the resources and tools that help promote mental health. All right, let's get into it. Before we begin, we always like to talk about mental health on a spectrum. We like to lay this foundation, right? All of us have physical health and all of us have mental health, right? It's really our state of being, right? It's how we cope with the day-to-day stresses of life, how we can work productively, how we can contribute to our communities, to our families, so on and so forth, right? So there are things that can affect our mental health, right? And that's how we move along this spectrum. So mental health challenges is really some of those day-to-day things that come up, right? So I have a meeting coming up. I might feel anxious about it. That might be a mental health challenge, right? Right now we're in COVID, so we might be dealing with loneliness, right? We might be dealing with some grief potentially, right? Or anxiety around COVID. These are mental health challenges that present themselves at any given time. Mental illnesses further along the spectrum are diagnosed conditions, right? So this is something that is diagnosed by a mental health professional. And these are illnesses and conditions that affect people's day-to-day functioning, right? So I may be experiencing anxiety because of something that's coming up, or I may be clinically diagnosed with anxiety, right? Which is something completely different. It affects my functioning consistently, right? So it's very important to understand that all of us have mental health. All of us may encounter mental health challenges, right? And some of us may encounter mental illnesses, right? But it's all along the spectrum, all right? With that said, let's talk about trauma. So real quickly, what do you think when you hear the word trauma? So please write in the chat some things that come to mind when you hear the word trauma, right? And if you can, what does it have to do with the workplace? So please feel free to jump in the chat and share what comes to mind. I'm gonna try to read off some of these responses. Injuries. Yes, injuries can be traumatic, certainly. Abuse, right? Of course, abuse is definitely traumatic. Loss can be traumatic. Pain, abuse again, stress, anxiety, pain. Yes, a lot of pain. Yes. What else do people think about trauma, and how does it relate to the workplace? Microaggressions. Ooh, workplace. Ooh, microaggressions can happen in the workplace. Hostile work environment, right? If there's trauma, or hostile work environments can create trauma. Yes. A life experience. Yes, that is dramatic. Thank you. Thank you. So a lot of good responses. I'm sorry I can't get to all of them, right? You can't concentrate sometimes. That's a good one. Thinking about some traumatic situations. Thank you for those responses. Some more are coming in. I appreciate that as well. So we have a definition of trauma, right? Individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or potentially life-threatening. And it has a lasting adverse effect on the individual's functioning, their mental, physical, social, emotional, and well-being, right? Put in very plain or a different terminology, we want to think about the 3 E's, right? There's an event that happened, or a series of events, or a set of circumstances. It is experienced physically or emotionally harmful, right? Or life-threatening, and it has adverse effects. So there's the event, there's the experience, it's experienced by someone or a group of people, and it has effects on them, right? And so those of you who were with us for Youth 101, we cover this, and we're going to cover it some more now. But trauma, it can last a long time. It can be a short period of time, right? So, different traumas are one-time situations. Sometimes they are longer situations, right? An injury could be a one-time injury, right? The trauma was one time, but you may still have adverse effects later on. You hurt your back, you might feel it 10 years from now, right? So there's an example of trauma. 1 in 3 youth will experience at least one adverse childhood experience, what we call an ACE, right? So 1/3 of the young people that you work with will experience an ACE, an adverse childhood experience. So important for us to know. So you all mentioned some types of trauma or what you think of. So I'm gonna get back in the chat. I know y'all really engaged. I appreciate that. What are some examples of trauma? And we have listed some. Anyone else want to mention anything else? So get in the chat. Let me see what you got. What types of trauma, or what are some examples of trauma? And maybe I could read some that were already submitted. Devastating events. Neglect, a type of trauma. Loss of a parent. Systemic racism. Yes, that is definitely a trauma. Child abuse, bullying. Yes, yes. Police interaction. Hey, Tiana, what's up? Misogyny. Yes, definitely traumatic. Divorce and separation. Yes, 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 yes. Thank you. Thank you for these types of traumas, and more comments coming in. I'm not able to read them all. So thank you for those examples of trauma. You mentioned some of the ones that are here, right? And so I'm just going to talk about a few of the other ones that are here, right? So we mentioned abuse, whether that be sexual, physical, right? Emotional. We mentioned neglect. Domestic violence, definitely a traumatic situation for the person who is receiving the domestic violence, for anyone that might be witnessing the domestic violence, but also for the person that might be perpetrating the violence, right? There's trauma all around in that situation. Natural disaster, someone mentioned, right? And so that's up here. Superstorm Sandy, definitely a traumatic situation. Hurricane Katrina, tsunamis, right? Famine. These are natural disasters that are traumatic, right? We have historical trauma, right? And someone mentioned systemic racism, right? There are traumas that have happened historically to groups of people that may have happened in the past. The Holocaust, that's a historical trauma, right? People still feel the effects of that today, right? So that's an example of a trauma. Forced displacement. Suppose you had to leave your country because of some situations that are going on there. And so you're now a refugee and you're displaced from your land, right? That's a traumatic situation, something that some of you may encounter with some of your participants. Of course, we mentioned bullying, institutional trauma. So child abuse and neglect, for instance, right? That's a traumatic situation. And oftentimes we rely on adult protective child services to intervene and provide a situation for this young person that may be experiencing something, right? But in the process of receiving services, there might be some institutional trauma, right? So I'm removing you from a home. That's traumatic. Even though you went through a traumatic situation, I'm removing you from a home. That is institutional trauma, an example of institutional trauma, right? The police, someone mentioned that, right? I may be calling the police because of some traumatic situation I'm encountering, but then my involvement with the police, there could be some institutional trauma there, right? One thing to think about when we think about trauma is, as we mentioned, is it a one-time situation? Is it repeated? Is it chronic, right? So there's the one-time injury, fine. But what if it's an injury that now continuously happens, right? Or some trauma that is continuously happening? Who is the person that is causing the trauma, right? Is it a person that is trusted, a known adult, like a parent or a relationship partner? Or is it a random person, an unknown person that we are interacting with? These things matter in terms of the effect of the trauma, right? These things can matter. So how does trauma affect us? We mentioned it has adverse effects. It can have adverse effects. You know, a traumatic experience, it impacts everything that a person encounters, right? It impacts the way that they learn, the way that they think about people, the way they remember things, how they trust people, you know, who they want to be around, right? Everything about trauma can affect everything, right? And so it affects the way that people view the world, right? If I'm a young person and someone that I love put me in a traumatic situation, that may potentially lead to me not being able to commit and trust people in the future, right? And that may have a way that I perceive different types of adults in the future, as an example, right? So it's very important to understand that trauma, it has a lasting impact, right? Even sometimes when we think the trauma has been addressed, right? It can creep up later on in life. So why is all this important as it relates to vicarious trauma, right? So vicarious trauma is what happens when we accumulate and carry the stories of trauma, right? So all these traumatic situations happen to individuals. But me as a service provider working with an individual who has experienced trauma, I'm collecting these stories. I myself may not have experienced the trauma, but hearing people relay their stories or seeing stories, right? Suppose we're watching things on the news or watching movies, or, you know, there's videos of all these negative interactions with police, right? These are all traumatic situations that we necessarily are not experiencing, but we may experience vicarious trauma. We may now experience the symptoms of trauma, right? We may start thinking about it. It may have an effect on us. It may make us distrustful, right? And so vicarious trauma happens because we're human and we work in human services and we make that empathetic connection with people, right? As a program provider, you're engaging with participants. That is our job and we love to do it, right? And they tell us stuff because they trust us. And now we are experiencing the trauma through their eyes, right? Vicariously, right? It's often sometimes referred to as secondary trauma, right? Because I'm not the first person. It's coming to me in a secondary nature. So vicarious trauma, it can't be managed. You know, if you work with people that have experienced trauma, it's going to happen because you're going to hear these stories. You can't tell a person not to share their trauma. We can't block out all the traumas in the world. It's just not possible. So it's going to happen, but we can manage it and we can support each other in our management of this vicarious trauma, right? And one way we do that is with awareness, right? We have to have conversations about what trauma is and what vicarious trauma is, right? So we need to talk to our staff about trauma, that the young people or the participants that we work with may have experienced some trauma, and this may come up, right? And we'll get into that later. So how does this play out in the workplace, right? What does vicarious trauma mean as someone that works with people that may be dealing with trauma, right? And so we have here this trauma response, right? There's something called intrusion. And intrusion is just the thoughts, right? You can't stop thinking about these experiences that someone may have relayed to you or something that you watch. It's in your mind. It's overwhelming. As someone mentioned in the chat earlier that they're not able to concentrate, right? Because you're thinking about these traumatic situations that some person went through and shared with you, right? It can lead to a loss of boundaries, right? You know, we hear this story from this young person at our center about the situation that they're in, and we want to be supportive, but we may lose boundaries in that attempt to be supportive, right? So traditionally, there was a time and period where the person could speak to me. Now I'm sending them my personal number because I want to try to support them, right? We mean well, but we have lost the boundary, right? So that's an example. Avoidance, right? Is exactly what it sounds like. I'm trying to avoid hearing about trauma because this vicarious trauma is affecting me so strongly. So that means I might lose empathy. So I might actually say to someone, hey, let's not talk about this right now. I don't want to engage in this conversation, right? I might not talk to a particular participant because I'm aware that they go through a lot of trauma and that's all they want to talk about. So I might avoid that participant, right? That's avoidance. I might just call out of work, period. Hey, I don't even want to do it. I might avoid paperwork, right? Because if I'm doing the paperwork on a particular incident, I might have to I'm thinking about that trauma again. right? So instead of putting all the proper details in this report, I might leave some things out because I don't want to think about it, right? Avoidance, arousal, right? And that's us trying to do something, right? I'm hearing about this trauma, I'm upset about it. Let's do something, right? And this is good. We should try to do something as much as possible, right? But we may become hyper vigilant about it, where we're thinking about it all the time and think about ways that we can do something to the point that we may not sleep well, right? Or we may not do our other job functions, right? I'm supposed to, set up this activity with my group, but I'm thinking about ways that I can intervene in some trauma that someone might be dealing with, right? These other things on the outskirts are other impacts of vicarious trauma, right? We're hearing about this trauma, as I mentioned earlier. It may not be something I experienced, but I'm hearing some young person speak about the trauma they're going through. Maybe then I'm losing my belief in the future, right? Maybe I'm losing my belief in humanity or my ability to trust others, right? Maybe I'm losing some hope, right? Maybe I'm feeling questions about self-esteem because I might be very similar to that person that experienced that trauma, right? If I see an interaction with the police that goes negatively, I might lose self-esteem because that situation could happen to me. Didn't happen to me yet, but it could, right? Intimacy, not in terms of romantic intimacy, certainly, but our job as program providers is to build relationships with our participants, right? If vicarious trauma is affecting me, I might not want to build solid relationships with my participants because I'm scared that they might tell me stuff, right? So now I'm building superficial relationships as opposed to strong and intimate potential, productive, positive, intimate relationships, right? Now I don't want to talk to participants. I don't want them to talk to me, right? It can affect our ability to learn, right? As a people, we should be learning about each other, right? Learning about culture. We learn about the community that we're in. That's how we're better at providing programs for the community. But this vicarious trauma might prevent us from wanting to learn, and it affects our ability to learn. So there are various ways that this vicarious trauma affects us and our ability to do our jobs, doing well, right? And so it's important for us to understand this so that we can support each other, right? So we're talking about different types of trauma, right? We've covered trauma. We're covering vicarious trauma. And I'm sorry, I just saw a comment. Thank you. And so collective trauma, I want to get into this idea of collective trauma. Some of you may be familiar with it. Some of you, this is our chance to learn about it, right? So collective trauma is community or social exposure to a large scale traumatic event. Someone mentioned disasters, right? And someone mentioned the pandemic. These are examples of collective traumas, right? It's something that's happening to a large portion of people. So we're all experiencing this trauma together. It's not to say that we are experiencing it the same way, right? Because the pandemic, for instance, some of us have not caught COVID-19, and we pray that that continues. Some of us have, right? So we're experiencing the pandemic, but we're not all experiencing it the same way, right? It's important for us to understand this idea of collective trauma, and program is a good example, right? Some of our programs are located in communities that experience a lot of collective trauma. Whenever there's a community incident of violence, that might affect a lot of people in the community, right? So you yourself at your center or at your program may not have been out there, but a lot of people might have been, right? And so it's important for us to understand that collective trauma can lead to vicarious trauma as well, right? And back to our COVID example, I haven't experienced COVID as in being affected, but I know people who have, and they expressed what that was like. And they're telling me their stories, or they're telling me about people that they may have lost, right? So now I'm feeling that vicariously. So we're all going through this collective trauma, but it can become a vicarious traumatic situation as well. All right. So I'm covering a lot, and this is a very heavy subject. So, I'm going to take a break real quick. And if anyone needs to take a break, definitely. But my break is really just launching a poll, right? So we're going to launch this trauma at my program poll. Now that we've learned about vicarious trauma and trauma, I want you to take a look at your program and answer this poll. Everything is anonymous. So if you feel comfortable answering this poll, go ahead and answer it. And we'll give everyone some time to answer it. And we'll close it down and then share the results so that we see what people are thinking, where people are. And as I said, my break is I'm going to drink this water. Hopefully we're getting some good responses, or some responses, excuse me. Death around us, definitely, you know, can be very traumatic. Yes. All right, let's get a couple more responses and let's share. Let's share. Let's see what we have. Do you feel that participants at your program are experiencing trauma? Yeah, overwhelming yes. You know, overwhelming yes. Some people are saying possibly, not sure. That's okay. That's okay. We can find out. Do you feel like your staff at your program is experiencing vicarious trauma? Yes, again, overwhelming. You know, someone wrote that they had, some people may have written that they didn't consider until today. That's why we're here, right? So that we can start understanding this and thinking about it and thinking about how we can support our staff, right? So thank you for those who were able to complete that poll. I appreciate that. So how do we start supporting staff? How do we start building this support? And we're going to get into this in depth, but these are a couple things that we can all try to do at the onset, just to start this process of support. We first have to create a physically and emotionally safe workplace, right? And so traumas are happening outside of our workplace, outside of our program. In our program, we want to make it as safe as possible, right? As physically safe as possible, right? So we have the rules and the agreements that prevent physical danger from happening to participants and staff, right? We have our safety plans, we have our guidance about physical interactions, what have you, right? We also want to make it emotionally safe. And for us in programming, that means how we talk to our participants, right? And how we talk to each other, right? How we enforce rules, right? Some of our policies around discipline, right, may not be as emotionally safe as we think they are. So these are things to think about. We have to name the impact of vicarious trauma with our staff, right? We have to let people know that this is something that they will encounter, right? But we're here to support you, right? Hey, you're a group leader. You build this relationship with these young people. They're, as you mentioned, as we mentioned in the poll, they may be experiencing trauma. There's a high likelihood, right? Overwhelming response. So because of that, you may experience some vicarious trauma, and that's okay. I just want to name it so that you're aware of it, right? And then let's regularly communicate about mental health. Let's talk about mental health, about our participants' mental health, about our staff's mental health, and let's make getting support easier, right? And we'll talk about that. So one of the things that we all want to do is introduce a vicarious trauma informed approach, right? And what this means is that as a program, organization, or system, we want to realize the widespread impact of trauma. So we want to make sure that everyone in our organization knows about trauma and how it can be impactful, right? And understands potential paths of recovery. So as we're dealing with vicarious trauma, we need to understand how we might be able to recover, right? Recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, right? So, you know, there are some things that will let you know that someone might be dealing with trauma, right? So as a trauma informed approach teaches us those things that to look out with our clients, with our, you know, our families, our staff, right? We want to fully integrate knowledge about trauma into all our policies, right? All of our procedures, all of our practices. As I mentioned, some of the things that we're doing at our sites, they may not be the safest. So we need to think about that, right? Which gets to the last point. We want to avoid re-traumatizing people, right? So if some person's trauma is domestic violence based in terms of, you know, verbal outbursts, then maybe we need to revisit the way that we talk to our participants at the center, right? Because we could be re-traumatizing them, right, at the program. So we're going to go into in depth on some things that each of us can do in different realms, right? And so in terms of creating a trauma-informed organization, right? We want to think about it in these levels. This is not exhaustive, but these are some areas that we want to think about it, and how we hire and what are our procedures around that. In employee health and wellness, assessment and evaluation. In terms of internal assessment, what are we doing? And let me see if this is existing in evaluation. How do we evaluate things, right? Job responsibilities, training and professional development, management and supervision. Managers, very important in helping stem vicarious trauma, and empowerment and environment, right? Which is potentially my favorite. So in terms of hiring, even before we ask some staff person to be part of our organization, we need to work with them and discuss the potential risks of working with survivors of trauma. As I mentioned, you're working at this program, there's a high likelihood that participants are dealing with some traumatic situations. Not all, but some. right? I need to let you know that in the interview process as a potential employee. I need to assess their knowledge of vicarious trauma. Are they aware? Do they know about this? It's okay if they don't, because we're going to teach them. We'll get to that. But maybe they do know a couple things. Good. What are some coping strategies that they use or have used in the past, right? And then we need to assess their level of preparation, right? If someone says, hey, I have no experience with trauma, it freaks me out, maybe they're not as prepared for the role, right? So these are some things to consider when we're hiring people and bringing them into our organization. In terms of employee health and wellness, right? Self-care. We have to allow our staff the opportunity to take care of themselves, right? And we need to support that, right? I put this quote up here, Audre Lorde, Women's History Month, shout out, a great woman from our history. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation. It's how I survive, right? If I don't take care of myself. And more important, well, nothing more important than taking care of yourself, but how this ties into the work, you can't give of yourself as fully as you want to, right? You can't pour water into someone's cup if your cup is not full. You're on the plane, you have to put your mask on first before you put someone else's, right? So self-care is very important, right? And there are some very basic things: drinking water, eating lunch, taking that walk, right? Unplugging, right? We talked about boundaries earlier. There's a time when I'm at the program, there's a time when I'm not, right? There's a time when I'm on the clock, there's a time I'm not. There are different things that people need to be able to engage with to take care of themselves. And as an organization, we need to support that, right? Mental health services, right? We need to make sure that the services we provide are strong and meeting the needs of our population, right? Of our population, but also our staff, right? And so some of your agencies have tons of mental health services available for participants and community members, but we need to look at what's available for staff as well, right? And so that's some parts of conversation that we need to bring up with our agencies, right? And like in terms of support, make sure that the support is confidential, right? We have to maintain that trust. If I come to a staff person and say, hey, I'm dealing with this, and it gets out to the whole community, then I'm not likely to come back and say something the next time I'm dealing with something, right? So we make sure that support is confidential and referrals are confidential. Assessment and evaluation. So some of you, most of you wrote that you think vicarious trauma is happening at your organization, at your program, and that's good. But there are ways that we can assess it to make sure, right? There are different things that we can do. We can survey our staff to see what their feedback is about the program overall, but also about what they're experiencing. There's something called the professional quality of life measure, right? And it helps organizations determine if their staff are experiencing things like vicarious trauma, burnout, chronic workplace stress, right? Anxiety about work. So this is something, we can pull some questions from this to include in our check-ins with our staff, just to get more information and assess, hey, is vicarious trauma at an all-time high, or is it high? It doesn't even have to be at an all-time high, right? We need to evaluate the interventions that we're employing, right? So we're doing all these things to try to support staff, but are the things we're doing working, right? Suppose we put some plan in place and staff are not using it. Just like we would do with our program, with our participants, we need to do the same thing with staff. Evaluate what we're trying to do to see if it's working. In terms of performance evaluations, these are excellent opportunities to engage in this conversation, right? It's not all about how well that staff person has been doing at their job. It could also be what things have been preventing you from doing as well as you can at your job. And that might be an opportunity for a staff person to say, hey, I've really been struggling with these traumatic situations that I keep hearing about, right? So maybe this is something that we want to infuse in our performance evaluation. And I already mentioned, we need to get feedback from our staff, right? Just like we get feedback from the community about the programs, we need to get feedback from our staff about how we are supporting them, right? As a manager, how have I been supporting you? How have I been supporting the team, right? Let's get this feedback so that we know what we need to do. In terms of job responsibilities, let's vary the duties. Some staff people are good at what they do, right? And sometimes we ask them to do other things that they may not necessarily be that strong at, which is okay. So let's vary it up, right? We need to alleviate the heavy workload, right? And so if I'm expressing to my supervisor, hey, I'm really going through these situations, then maybe I need to take a break from the situation that is causing me this, right? So if I'm hearing all these traumatic stories from my current group, maybe I need to rotate into another group for a time being so that I'm able to better prepare myself for my return back to that group, right? So we need to spread the caseload, promote collaboration, You know, if all of us can get together and talk about situations, then we probably could find a solution much quicker than if it's just left on individuals, right? And so, you know, there's some programs that have the afternoon shift and have the evening shift. Let's all collaborate and talk about what's going on. So, hey, these are some situations that I'm experiencing after school. Does anyone have any ideas? And maybe someone in the evening program will say, you know what? This is some things I think could work, right? So let's work together, promote that collaboration so that if anyone is experiencing these vicarious trauma situations, maybe there's some answer that we can come up with collectively, or someone that we're not thinking about may have the answer because we haven't collaborated with them, right? So just like there's vicarious trauma, there's this idea of vicarious resilience. You know, resilience is ultimately how we deal with these traumatic situations, right? And so you can hear about stories of trauma and experience vicarious trauma. You can also hear about stories of resilience and start building resilience. You ever are in a situation, have you ever been in a situation where someone says, hey, I was going through that and this is what I did to help myself? And now you hear that and you say, oh, wow, okay, maybe I could start doing that. So now that's that vicarious resilience, right? So it's important for us to allow for conversation as safely as possible, right? Because we don't want to re-traumatize people, but as safely as possible so that we can come up with solutions together and build this vicarious resilience together, right? Training and professional development. Oh, we got some questions. Good. We're going to get to that. Training and professional development. So oftentimes there's orientation, and it happens when a staff person is starting. So the new staff orientation, and then we forget about the continuous training. You know, your orientation might be a week. You know, I'm supposed to learn everything about this job in a week. It's not necessarily possible, right? But over time, I will continue to learn if there's ongoing education, right? So we have to think about the way that we want to train staff and train them consistently, right? So that they're constantly improving, right? In terms of training and professional development, not only about the job, but just in general, right? If we're able to fill people with skills, then they feel better about the job they're doing, just in general, right? Because my company has taken a belief and investment in me, period, right? I want to train my staff on how to do their job, but I'm also interested in what they do and what they want to do eventually, right? So let's provide this professional development and develop these new skills. In terms of resilience, right? Maybe there is some training around resilience, or maybe there's some training on how to deal with particular traumatic situations that a staff person can get involved with to better prepare them to hear these traumatic stories. How to engage in conversations with young people about mental health situations, or about violence, or positive dating, or whatever the situation might be. There's all types of training that's out there. Let's allow our staff to participate in that training, right? Let's connect with other organizations. You know, as I mentioned, your agency, your CBO probably has a lot of services. Other agencies and CBOs have a lot of services as well. Let's connect with them. You know, there are organizations that specialize in vicarious trauma, or specialize in domestic violence or child abuse or whatever. And maybe our organization does not. So let's collaborate with them so that we can find these training opportunities and better support our staff. Management and supervision. As I mentioned, management, very, very important. Oftentimes, a staff person is going to go talk to their manager before they go talk to the HR person or someone else, or the mental health counselor or whatever, right? The social worker. They're going to go approach their manager, right? So we need to train our managers to be able to be ready for this conversation, right? How can I engage my staff in this conversation? What type of resources are available that all of my managers need to know about, so that if someone brings something up to them, we can point them to resources, right? We need to have conversations about trauma and vicarious trauma in our check-ins, in our supervision, right? Some of you, when program starts, before program starts, you get the staff together. Hey, this is our plan for the day. Cool. That's great. That's a great form of check-in, right? Maybe we can mention, hey, there's something that happened recently, and it could lead to some traumatic conversations. Let's think about what we might say in these situations, or how we might be supported, right? An example of ways that we can use supervision, or us getting together to talk about this, right? Of course, you can talk about it individually when you're in your individual supervision with your staff people, right? You're meeting with staff on a weekly basis or bi-weekly or whatever it is, just checking with them and see how they're doing about it. This is all about clear communication. We want to make sure that we're consistently talking about this. As we mentioned, we want to bring awareness to it, right? When we're giving feedback about situations, let's try to be positive and constructive, right? Hey, you did a bad job. That's not positive or constructive. I see that you weren't necessarily your best in that situation, this might be a way that you can address it in the future. You know, a little less harsh, right? And constructive, because I'm giving you an idea on how to improve in the future, right? And so if someone is expressing that, you know, they weren't able to interact positively with a person that shared a traumatic situation, you know, let's think about how we can do it constructively in the future, right? We want to make sure we explain and clarify roles, responsibilities, and performance expectations, right? And this gets to, as you know, at our program, there are some staff. This is the art specialist. They're here to work on the art projects, the art lessons, to engage the kids in art. All right. Let's clarify that role. They are not necessarily the social worker. It's not to say that they can't hear some information, but we can't expect them to perform the same level of work that the social worker would perform. Right. So make sure that we're clear about these roles and responsibilities and prepare them to send someone to the appropriate level person. Right. So at our agency or at our program, someone is responsible for calling the state central registry if we suspect child abuse. It may be everyone's trained at the program, but maybe it's one person that is particularly supposed to do it. So if a complaint comes in, then we know who to funnel it to, right? So make sure we explain these policies and expectations to our staff so everyone knows. Empowerment and environment. Right. As I mentioned earlier, we want to create this safe environment for our participants and for our staff, right? We want to make it comfortable. Someone please mute yourself. We want to make it comfortable for participants and staff to share different situations that they are dealing with, right? We want to create a culture of caring and support, right? And so how do we do that? A lot of the things that we mentioned, but we want to build this situation where staff feel supported with the situations that they're dealing with, right? That there is care. When someone expresses something, we go through the proper strategies to support them, right? We want to foster connections with people. You know, we are people that love to be around people. That's why we're in the people work, right? So let's build those connections internally, right? Let's get people together. Let's find these commonalities and celebrate, right? You know, if there are parents at our program, let's get parents together and create a parenting group, right? That's an example of fostering connection, right? What else do we have here? Diverse workforce, right? We want to celebrate the diversity of our workforce, right? We want to hire diversity, obviously, but we want to continue to celebrate the diversity and learn from each other, learn from different experiences. I talked about working collaboratively. I may not have experience as a parent, but other staff people do. So let's, you know, celebrate that so that I know how to deal with parents or parenting situations, as an example, to keep that one going, right? So we want to make sure to do that, to foster these connections. Sorry, I'm getting a little distracted, but let me see, next slide. Here we go. So the reason why we talk about social support is because it is a protective factor. In every aspect of mental health, support can be very helpful, right? The social support. And so the reason why is because, you know, support, feeling a part of something, it gives you that sense of belonging, right? It helps you feel respected, it helps you feel cared for, it helps you feel loved, right? We know that there's a connection between mental health and physical health as it relates to relationship, right? Some people make us feel better, right? Being part of a group makes us feel better, right? And it can improve or reduce, you know, negative symptoms that you may be encountering, right? So again, this vicarious trauma situation, if I'm hearing about these traumatic situations and it's just me and I don't have anyone to share this with, I'm going to feel that. But if I'm able to let it out and talk in a group and someone else says, hey, I've been hearing that too, and I've been feeling those symptoms too, now we're talking about it together and I'm not feeling the symptoms by myself, right? So it's very important that we facilitate social support to build this protection, to help people become resilient. So some of the things that we might do to create the supportive environment, right? We, as I mentioned, support groups, right? We might get the people together and figure out ways that they can support each other. We might talk about it collectively as a group. Hey, what has been happening? Okay, let's get it off our chest. Yeah, this situation happened. Okay, well, how are you dealing with it? Okay, good. So that way we can just let it go, potentially let it go, right? Some of these things we can't let go, right? I mentioned affinity groups, you know, parent groups, you know, the people of color group, you know, there's all types of ways to create these affinity groups or employee resource groups where people can, that share identities, can talk amongst themselves and provide resources with themselves, right? To support each other, right? excuse me, on your board at your program. You may have this board where you highlight different staff people, right? That can be a way that you acknowledge things that are going on, situations that happen, how staff responded, right? That can be a form of support. If I walk past and I see, hey, Chris got a star. He's our star employee because he was able to handle a difficult situation between two participants. And this is how he did it. That's a form of social support. I didn't know about that, but now I read about it. Good. And you're acknowledging the person for their work, which is acknowledgement. Those of us that were in burnout last week, we know acknowledgement is important. Acknowledgement helps people feel good about the job that they're doing, right? So there's various ways that you can foster social support. What are some ways that you all have been fostering social support at your program? So this is another opportunity to get in the chat real quick and share some things that you are doing to create this social supportive space for staff. I'm going to try to read off some responses. Oh, everybody's shy now. One-on-one check-ins, right? Okay. So you're supporting people individually. We got a weekly check-in meeting, right? So all the staff is getting together. What other types of things? Make sure that I make myself available to listen when someone needs to talk. There's a virtual coffee hour, right? We get together, not necessarily about work. We just chit-chat. Okay, good. What else we got? We're celebrating birthdays, right? We might have the birthday celebration at the end of the month for all of our staff, right? Oh, okay. I see that you like comic books. You like comic books. Let's get you together. I know y'all like comic books. Okay, what else we got? I'm reading things off that I would do. Okay, weekly check-ins, weekly debriefs or debriefs after situations, certainly. What other types of opportunities are you creating for staff to feel supportive and socialize, right? There's the mental health check-ins, right? We checking in with our staff. Hey, how you feeling today? We got the happy face chart like we do with our participants, right? Okay, highs and lows, right? Extra supervision, open door policy. Okay, so all these supervisors are strong managers. Virtual water cooler moments. Now, this is what I'm talking about. When we talk about a book, when we talk about cooking, weekly crafts. Okay, virtual support groups. Yes. So there are various ways to create these supportive environments. So I want to talk about some resources real quick, and then we'll get into some question and answer. So I mentioned workplace support. We have a webinar on our website that speaks specifically about different ways that you can create a peer support program. All right. The American Heart Association has created a couple toolkits or has guidance around building resilience, right? So how can you help people build resilience? We talked about that. I mentioned the professional quality of life scale. The link right here will tell you. And as I mentioned, it measures employee compassion, their satisfaction, their burnout, secondary trauma, all these types of things. So there might be questions in there that you can pull out to ask your staff in a survey, right? The 21-day self-care challenge, very important. I mentioned self-care, right? And we have to engage in this, right? We have to take care of ourselves. So there could be some good ideas in there of ways to take care of yourself for your staff to take care of themselves, all right? And of course, staying in balance, another great toolkit. All these resources are great. We'll make sure that you get the PowerPoint presentation and send you some additional resources. Woo. So I've covered a lot and we still have time. This is great. What are some questions, if you have any? I'll do my best to try to answer some. Hopefully you receive some answers to questions you may have been thinking about. But please write in the chat any questions that you might have. I think we may have had some questions in the RO. Okay. Any questions, please? Any questions? All right, I'm gonna take a look. I think someone did send me a question directly. Oh, and I should mention that if you don't feel comfortable sharing your question in the general chat, you can reach out to me directly via direct message or to Sophie or to Crystal or to Josephine, and they will relay the question without saying your name. I'm trying to find that question. The person who typed me a question directly, can you type it again? I'm sorry. I just can't find it right now. Okay. While you all think about questions, I'm just going to announce, I'm going to open an evaluation poll real quickly, which just provides feedback to us on how you feel about the presentation, and it really helps us prepare for future presentations. All right. And so I would appreciate any feedback that we can receive there. All right. And now some questions are rolling in. Oh, Rashid, what's up, man? How's it going, brother? When it comes to mental health, at what point will we address the largest social, a society by white supremacy, very big, I got you, has led to harsh realities we need to combat? Thank you for that question, Rashid. And so that could be part of your conversation with staff, right? Is helping them understand larger social structures and how that, like white supremacy, right, and how that might affect or create trauma for participants and for themselves, right? Some people are not aware of these structures or not aware of the impact of the structures, right? So conversations about that can help bring that awareness. In terms of addressing those structures, we've been trying to address them for a long time, but that could be part of the conversation as well. What are some coming up collectively with strategies that we can address these structures, right? That could be an exercise that you engage with staff and everyone feels invested, and then you come up with some things and work together on addressing some of these societal structures, right? But thank you for that question, Rashid. Okay, in terms of self-care, wow, it's coming in fast and furious. Good. Anyone that has to end off early, we have finished with the presentation. So if you have to step off, you have some time back to take care of yourself before your next meeting or before the kids come in. Yes, we will send the PowerPoint. The previous session's PowerPoint should be sent to you as well. If not, we'll make sure it gets to you and might get sent collectively together. I know that they're working on housing this on a website or on DY City Connect or on, not DY City Connect, Jesus, that's so old. Whatever the new system is, maybe it is Connect. All right, are there any questions that I'm missing? Here we go. What is the option for alleviating caseload? Any other options or suggestions? So, this is a tough one because sometimes we don't have enough staff to alleviate the caseload, right? But we may need to try to take a look at what we have, right? And so in terms of programming, right, some groups are smaller than others, some groups are bigger than others, right? And this may have to do with registration and who is attending the program, but as much as possible, maybe we should try to alleviate some of the stress of some groups, right? If one group has 50 participants and 3 staff and another group has 10, maybe we need to spread that out, right? So that's an example of how we can alleviate the caseload in that regard, right? In terms of programming. In terms of other situations, yeah, sometimes we have to identify more staff people, right? Or other people that step in. Yeah, I'm not normally involved in group activities because I'm the director or because I'm the art specialist or the social worker, but there might be an instance where I can step in and help with some group facilitation, right? Or I can provide a program to provide relief for other staff members that are at the site, right? So instead of, the art specialist, so the kids move from their group, come to my program, and they're with me for that 30 minutes or 40 minutes so that they're not necessarily stressing or with their staff for that 40 minutes, right? So these are ideas of ways that we can split that caseload up, right? All right, any other questions? My colleagues, did you get any questions? Did we miss anything?
Nothing on my end, Chris.
Solid.
No questions over here.
All right, so I'm going to just close out with some more resources real quickly before people depart. As I mentioned, on our website, you can take a look at all the resources that we have. We have tons of webinars on various topics related to mental health. We have some around burnout, around vicarious trauma, a more in-depth conversation about vicarious trauma. We have how to support colleagues of color, how to build an anti-racist workplace. A lot of great webinars, all for free, can be viewed anytime, can be shared with staff, can be viewed collectively. If you want to have a consultation about things that you might be able to implement at your site, send that email. I'll make sure to answer it as best as we can and try to support you as best as we can. In general, mental health support is available, right? There's on our Thrive NYC website, there is a guide to mental health services that people can access while at home. Some of us are doing remote programming. Some of us are doing programming in the building still. Either way, this guide updated regularly with all types of resources that can support people, period, right? There are intersections, right? If I'm have some food insecurity, then that might cause me some mental health strain because I'm worried about how I'm going to feed my family, right? So this guide tries to address all the potential situations a person can be involved with that can contribute to some mental health strain, right? Of course, follow Thrive NYC on Twitter, for updates about events, about resources, all types of things. So yeah, so I appreciate everyone being a part of our training today. Hopefully it was very helpful and you all got something out of it. Yes, the PowerPoint for burnout will be available. The PowerPoint for vicarious trauma will be available. And just trying to make sure if there was any other questions. Doesn't seem like it. This is the end of our training. So, 5 minutes back, I'm trying to, give y'all some time to take care of yourselves. But thank you all for participating, and everyone have a great Friday. If you are doing some programming, maybe today's a good day to get outside.